When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Have you ever caught yourself holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time? Maybe you think of yourself as an honest person, but recently lied to someone you love. That uncomfortable tension you feel, psychologists call cognitive dissonance, and it's at the heart of many of our most stubborn disagreements. Leon Festinger coined this term in the 1950s after studying a UFO cult that predicted the end of the world. When the apocalypse didn't happen, members didn't abandon their beliefs, they doubled down, claiming their faith had saved humanity. This mental gymnastics happens because our brains hate inconsistency. We'll twist logic, ignore evidence, or rewrite history just to maintain internal harmony. In relationships, cognitive dissonance creates peculiar dynamics. Your partner might insist they're not jealous while interrogating you about every text message you've sent. A friend claims they're happy for your promotion, but makes subtle digs about your new responsibilities. These contradictions aren't necessarily lies. They're the mind's attempt to reconcile conflicting feelings. The workplace offers another area for dissonance. An employee complains about a company culture while resisting every proposed change. We all do this dance between our ideals and our actions. Understanding cognitive dissonance transforms how we approach disagreements, potentially. When someone's position seems irrational, they might be protecting themselves from psychological discomfort. That climate change skeptic who lives in a flood-prone area, they might be managing the dissonance between their lifestyle choices and environmental reality. Recognizing these patterns in ourselves is equally important. When we feel defensive during an argument, we might be experiencing a dissonance between our self-image and our behavior. And the key isn't eliminating these contradictions. We're all walking bundles of inconsistencies all the time. Instead, it's about acknowledging them with curiosity rather than judgment. And this awareness can create space for more honest conversations, whether we're discussing politics at Thanksgiving, it's always Thanksgiving, or negotiating chores with one of our roommates. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Lara Schwartz. Lara is the author of Try to Love the Questions, which is a practical guide to dialogue in classrooms and life. She's a civil rights lawyer who teaches at American University, where she also leads their dialogue program. Lara, tell us an argument story.
Sure, thank you. Running a dialogue program, it was interesting to think about this question of an argument that I've had, because the premise of my work is to design the dialogue sessions and experiences such that we don't see a bunch of arguing, we see a bunch of exploration. So I really like this prompt to kind of dig into my past.
Explain the difference as you dig into your past for you between arguing and exploration.
Yeah. And sometimes arguing, I think we'll call debate, where we have two positions and maybe two people or two sides, where each side has taken a stance and they're defending it. And they're saying, mine is better than yours. And usually in my dialogue work, usually in the classroom experiences I try to design as a teacher in my classes, or in the workshops that I design for broader groups, what I try to do, and this is the focus of my book as well, is pivot from like a binary setup, so red, blue, yes, no, Trump, Harris, right, to more expansive framings where there are infinite possible answers, and you have to engage in some amount of shared exploration and inquiry to come to them. So instead of saying like, do you agree with mask mandates, which is a yes, no question, you would say like, under what circumstances can people in power set up rules that everyone has to follow for public health? And what you get, instead of two pitched disagreeing teams, like I'm the COVID mask people and I'm the, free me people, is like, well, probably everybody in the room agrees you could be required to wear like a biohazard suit in a contaminated zone, and
in an Ebola lab.
nobody agrees you could be required to do that, like just walking through your city on a normal day. And so how we come up with a principled answer to like, well, when can we, when do we submit to the authority of someone else to tell us what precautions to take is the premise. It's the premise of my book, and it's the premise of my teaching, that we spend time exploring and inquiring, and hopefully come not just to like my side won, like my team won, and we think vaccines are terrible, or we think, listen to science. Well, science disagrees all the time. But instead, okay, what are the principles upon which we think, we can govern ourselves? But that being said, I did come up with a fun disagreement story. So I don't plan to disappoint you.
Well, I'm interested too. I mean, the premise of the show, of course, I ask every guest, what's a disagreement that stuck with you that you can't get out of your head? And I'm interested in your answer to the alternate question based on your framework, which is what's an exploration you had that you can't get out of your head? The similar premise, because at least in my experience, just to stay with this, and I want to jump into your story, which is that, of course, these kinds of antagonistic questions where we have red team, blue team, black team, white team, up versus down, we're dug into our entrenched positions. Of course, that can reinforce existing places where we don't get along. And at the same time, these kinds of yes, no, good, bad questions can be decent entry points to exploring gray areas, provided the structure allows us to take multiple positions. There's switch side debates. You're arguing for positions you don't necessarily already agree with. You're researching positions you already don't agree with. And so there's a kind of a forced perspective taking that can lead to gray area discussions and separate decent information from not so decent information at the same time.
Well, and that's the exploration I can't get out of my head, which my ideas, we have these binary questions and then what I call more lovable questions. And the title of the book, Try to Love the Questions, and the idea of lovable questions, I take from Letters to a Young Poet. Rilke says, try to love the questions themselves, as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. The exploration is, which questions are we going to engage with? And I think this has been framed all kinds of ways in our current moment. So when do we so-called platform or deplatform people? In other words, are there people that you would just never invite on your show? Or are there people that I would just never invite as a guest lecturer? And that's pretty easy for me as a professor. I'm not going to invite somebody who doesn't have some degree of gravitas and attainment in law or policy, right? The trick, it's easier for law. I'd be like, well, they should be a lawyer. They should have worked on some legal things. It gets harder in politics, of course, I think, because the qualifications to be in politics are you jump in. And so I can jump in and say, my position politically, because I'm heterodox, is you should go to the roof in the event of a fire. I don't actually find this position all that distinctive from you should never get a vaccine, right? And the difference is nobody's come up with it and made it their political platform yet. So it's hard because, importantly, and I teach constitutional law, our Constitution set some limits on what can be considered politically by saying like, well, we're just not going to have being Methodist the official religion of the US, right? Because that would violate the First Amendment. And we're just not going to have banning the word artichoke because that would violate the First Amendment. In politics, if you tried to have the kind of guardrails the Constitution puts, you'd also violate the First Amendment. So if you said, well, there can't be a candidate who wants to make Methodist, their Methodist as the official religion, their platform. AU is originally a Methodist university.
Right.
You couldn't do that. Almost the reverse guardrails that apply both to academia and law sort of reverse apply for the political world. Because our First Amendment says, like, we don't kick arguments out of the public square. So famously, the First Amendment cases that my students read at American University School of Public Affairs and lots of people read, about the First Amendment, they involve speech by pretty extreme, outlying, and most of us would agree, kind of abhorrent characters.
Mm-hmm.
So our incitement case is called Brandenburg, and it's about the KKK. And you wouldn't invite someone from the KKK, I think, on this show, most likely. But the First Amendment doesn't kick that person out of the public square to make their case. So I think the intractable and challenging inquiry that I continue to grapple with is, okay, what are the limits of the kinds of questions that we ask about and inquire about as a society?
Yeah. Well, let's take that in real terms. How have you encountered that? Or what's a case that sticks out? What's a specific disagreement or exploration that sticks out for you as you ask this question? I love the distinction between binary versus lovable questions. And so speaking for you or speaking for society, what are these limits you talk about?
Sure. Well, so I think an example would be, let's take our current conversation nationally about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. I have never met anybody who thinks that every DEI initiative that they've participated in or heard about worked well. And I don't think I've ever met anybody who doesn't agree that a university should be able to have like recruiters who go to rural schools, just so the students in rural schools know, like, hey, University of Maryland exists and you could go there. You might not have heard as much about us.
Right.
But, and the thing is, that's actually DEI, right? Deciding that your incoming class should include students from all kinds of counties and spaces, like that's DEI. And so the question becomes like, under what circumstances should programming and communications and curriculum and everything touch in some way on the goals to be inclusive or the goals to be equitable or the goal to be diverse? And there are a million fantastic conversations you can have. What does that mean for recruiting? What does that mean for decision making? What does that mean for how your website is designed? I think we wouldn't have a conversation, which used to be the dominant one in this country up until like 50 years ago. Oh, wait, or should we just have an all-white institution? Not functionally, because I think there are ways you could strip away all manner of initiatives until you got universities that were very monoculture. But I don't think you'd see anyone kind of allowed, like on this podcast or in a legislature, saying like, what if we revived the Jim Crow approach? And I think it's good that we don't have that conversation. I'm actually fine, even as a dialoguer, and saying like, I don't think we necessarily, I'm not going to have in my class like, hey, was Jim Crow better? Should we do that? And I think implicitly, all of us, even us sort of pro-dialoguers, know that a bunch of conversations have left the window of what we discuss, And Sigal Ben-Porath, who I really admire, who maybe could be on this show, in her book Cancel Wars, she, something I quote more often than almost anything, is she talks in her book Cancel Wars about how most of these questions that we have about free expression on campuses and elsewhere, they're really not questions about whether we think expression should be free. They're really questions about which questions we think have already been answered. And so some people, and it includes, most scientists, think the question of whether climate change is a thing that's caused by human actions has been answered. Politically, though, that's not the answer. And there are other questions that we've sort of answered and foreclosed. And I would say sometimes answering and foreclosing a question it betters society. So the question of whether women can vote. So every one of us, I think, agrees that some questions are closed to discussion. The politics, debate, partisanship, all of it, most often, I believe, comes down to what you think the line is between questions we should still be arguing about and ones that we're done arguing about.
Yeah, I think that's a great determination. You know, if you open Lara Schwartz's University for Open Inquiry, of which, of course, you would appoint yourself czar, how would you decide on that campus which questions are opened and closed, or even a method by which everyone could come up with a decent determination?
So for your listeners, I think being a college president is not a job I want very much at all in this moment. But you know,
well, you would
so
be czar, not president.
Well, my people do that well under czars. I think one answer, right, to be a little cute, is I don't think my university would have a czar. I think we'd have some principles, right? I think when we answer questions like this one or any with, well, there's a person is often the wrong answer. Now, in the legal system, like, a judge is a person who decides, but they don't decide because they're Judge Lee, right, who's very learned. They decide because they're a judge, and they decide based on a principle. And this is the case in every academic discipline. So we let, not Dr. Fujii, who's a scientist, but we let the scientific method answer, and we let peer review answer. So I think in my university, we wouldn't have a person, we'd have a process. And could we eventually have an adjudicator of some kind? I don't think so. The way the First Amendment answers these questions is it says, if you're not inciting violence, if you're not targeting and harassing a person, your conversation gets to go forward. And that is my recommended policy for my new university. However, the First Amendment is a limitation on government authority. It's not a way to run a university. It's not a blueprint for how to be a scholar or a better person. So I think the way that we would decide which conversations are worth having is we'd purport to try to have them, and we'd engage in our kind of big meta dialogue. What is it we're trying to accomplish here? And I would say the best shorthand for that is, I've often defined dialogue as what you do when you want to understand. And I think if your conversation is not moored to that goal of understanding, it might not be the conversation to have. So, like, we won't become more learned about the world and more capable of being in it if we have a conversation about whether, star belly Sneetches are smarter than plain belly Sneetches, right? Like a racial supremacy argument,
right?
Because we all know all the Sneetches already are made about the same.
And I'm seeing, at least as you're talking about these different approaches to figuring out what questions are open and closed, whether it's in a corporation or a town meeting or a university or over Thanksgiving, the classic Thanksgiving example, which is there are some questions that are open-ish and some questions that are closed-ish. And we know that because there is a community that we have sanctified as experts on these questions, whether it's race or science or anything, or history or anything like that. And they have come to a large consensus that dinosaurs, in fact, existed. Now, within that consensus, we have some ruptures about whether the Brontosaurus, for instance, really existed, and how we interpret very specific, million-year-old femurs and things of that question. But largely the question of did they exist is closed, and we know that because experts have said so via consensus. Versus the other interpretation, which is a more radical free speech option, which is there is no such thing as an open or closed question, say what you will, ask what you will, with limitations against incitement.
So I guess two places that I would diverge from what you've shared. One is that I wouldn't say that the questions become closed because a specific community has closed them or specific people are anointed or sanctified. And I think an important thing, right, is that we should all be able to come to understand. That's really important. And that's what education is for. So, like, we know that dinosaurs existed, but it's really important for our policy that every, K to 12 student can come to learn, well, how do we know that? Right? That's how did science determine that? And then it's really important to our policy. We know some answers to First Amendment or constitutional questions, but it's very important that every community member gets access to understanding what that thought process was. So I would replace the idea of like communities and people have decided with, processes and sort of agreed methods have decided. So not that it's scientists, but that it's science. And then I think the other is just that I wouldn't characterize the free for all as a free speech argument.
Mm-hmm.
Because the free expression question, the question of whether something's protected speech, the only thing that answers is whether it can be censored or punished, not whether it's any good. So these are two separate questions, right? And this has been really hard in this moment in the last year or so when people have said, like, is this protected expression or is it anti-Semitic? Like, well, it could be both. The free speech question is only the question of whether the thing can be said at all without either being barred from being said or being punished by the authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Not even whether it's punishable by others. So if you have someone on this podcast and they use a slur or they engage with an ancient trope or a stereotype.
Right.
The free speech answer is you can air the podcast, but the free speech answer is also that you can get a jillion emails and texts and tweets and things that say like you shouldn't have, or that's terrible, or that person could lose their job if they're working at, a private corporation or a university where not as a faculty member. So, and free speech doesn't mean that we can't have kind of academic standards. It doesn't, free speech can coexist with and is necessary to things like the scientific method or rigorous inquiry or peer review. It just takes away the one tool in the toolkit of a certain kind of government censure or punishment. It doesn't take away like our standards. And then, of course, our personal decision making to say like, I will fight to the death to ensure that someone who goes on your podcast and says the bad thing, doesn't get jailed for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'll also fight to the death to be able to be like, everybody gets to tell you it was an enormous error of judgment to host this person. If that makes sense.
It does make a ton of sense. My last question's kind of a doozy, hopefully a big sum up, which is we're obviously as a culture between the political parties, between communities, of course, on college campuses everywhere, and obviously on social media, having this big debate that you and I have talked about, a dialogue even, about dialogue, this sort of meta conversation about what should we do amidst rising distrust, rising polarization, and rising silence, an inability to confront these things, a kind of conflict avoidance and suppression. What could be said? What should be said? Should we have a debate? Should we have a dialogue and so forth? Mm-hmm. Amidst all the kind of Sturm and Drang about this meta conversation, dialogue about dialogue, what's your best piece of advice, or what's the thing that sticks with you most in terms of how to sort through these thorny issues?
Yeah. At the campus level in particular, understand that disagreement is a skill that can be studied, that must be taught and practiced, and make opportunities for the skill of disagreement to be practiced. From my perspective, and this is in part because I'm a teacher, the best thing that we can do, and this includes at the K to 12 level and at the college level, the best thing that we can do is invest in tools for faculty to design excellent sort of dialogue and disagreement experiences for their students. As a society, I have a couple of tips and tricks. So maybe you're a listener who's not in a college classroom or any classroom. And many of them are in my book. So, and it's a paperback. It's not a very expensive book. It's like $16. So, check it out. But a couple of things to try. So thing one, resist the binary questions. So if you hear someone say, doesn't Israel have a right to defend itself? That's a very binary question. And there are lovable questions within it.
Right.
Under what circumstances is a government action self-defense? These are rich questions. So resist the binaries and be on the alert. When are you being asked to engage with something like it's a yes/no question when it's really not?
Mm-hmm.
So that's my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice is to be aware of the difference between middle ground and common ground. I think a lot of the place that dialogue gets a bad rap is that it sounds like this effort to shut up the people who care and turn them all into like very polite centrists. And you could engage in the deepest and best dialogue and still feel profoundly strongly that one answer is the right answer. In fact, you might even feel more strongly about that as you truly learn more and more. When we have dialogue that is inquiring, that involves what would we do if we wanted to understand, we sometimes come to understand and we deepen our commitments. Like you could have the best designed dialogue in the world and come away with a deepened and strengthened commitment to vaccine access. That would be the likely outcome of a well-designed dialogue. So understand that you don't have to compromise because you're dialoguing. Remember that dialogues exist to understand better, including to understand other participants and where they come from. So middle ground is a compromise. Maybe half of us should get a vaccine, right? Common ground is the animating things that make us believe the thing that we do or the desires that we have that motivate our positions. And one of the things that I've found is that we can find common ground in almost every dialogue. So I've taken this vaccine example. People who have passionate disagreements about vaccines share the common ground of desiring health and safety. I think it would be rare to meet someone who holds a position and it's like, well, I feel this way because I want people to be injured by measles, or I want people to be injured by pharma, right? That's not what's going on. And so taking a moment to find the good faith in the argument you're having, there might not be a good argument for somebody's position, but there might be a really human shared value behind their position. And when we can start from that common ground, okay, everybody in this room desires community safety. Everyone in this room really believes in education. I find that we take our temperature down quite a bit.
Lyra Schwartz, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thank you.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.